Over the past 5 years, we've seen electricity rates go up 23%, and Duke has been consistently recording record profits. In every forum that we're in these days, data centers is the most pressing issue. Duke is projecting that we are going to need about 8 times the amount of electricity over the next 15 years.
I think AI and data centers is going to be the topic in 2028. Hey, welcome on into another show. I'm Tim Boyum. George Martin off this week. He has vacation. I guess he had some days we had to give him, so he's off. I'm doing this solo. That's why you're going to see a one shot of me and my guest this week and not cutting back and forth between cameras. So listen, I don't know if you've heard, but there's a little bit of debate over how we're going to provide enough energy in the future in these data centers, renewable energy, solar panels. It's an incredibly hot topic going on across the country and, of course, right here in North Carolina. A couple weeks ago, we had Matt Abele from the Sustainable Energy Association here in North Carolina on Capitol tonight, and we talked off camera for must have been 45 minutes, and I thought to myself, man, we need to do this, on the record. And so that's what we're doing this week. The Sustainable Energy Association, which you'll hear about in a minute, tackles a lot of issues. Solar's a big one of those. And so I'm going to ask him about some of those things, critics. What do you do when the sun's not out? How does that energy last? What do we do with the panels once, we don't use them anymore? And how does it play a role with nuclear and other renewables and other sources of energy? And yes, we're going to talk about data centers, which is a hot topic. And really just how do we provide enough energy, even beyond data centers? It's a really fun, fascinating question and conversation. So let's get right to it. Matt, first of all, it's great to see you. Let's talk about your organization first. What is Sustainable Energy Association?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. It's good to be here. So we're with the North Carolina Sustainable Energy Association. So we're a 501c3 nonprofit based in Raleigh, but we cover the entire state of North Carolina. And, when you ask, what is sustainable energy to us and what is it that we focus on, I think that has changed over the years. We've been around for almost 48 years at this point. We originally started as the North Carolina Solar Energy Association when a lot of these technologies that we cover were fairly nascent, right? And it really started with homesteaders out in the western part of the state that were looking for a reason to be not connected to the grid, to be fully off grid and power all their own operations. And it's really matured since then. North Carolina has grown to one point being number 2 in installed solar in the country. I think you heard that from one of your previous guests, Ry Barcott. And a lot of that is just due to a lot of our forward-thinking policies here in North Carolina that have really embraced the economic opportunities that this presents for the state and for North Carolinians all across 100 counties across the state of North Carolina. And so now sort of our vision, right, is these are the technologies that can help to reduce costs for ratepayers. Consistently we see now when you start to rank different technologies against one another, solar and battery storage are consistently the cheapest cost form of energy available and the quickest to develop moving forward. And so, I think when we show up and when we have conversations with legislators and with regulators at the North Carolina Utilities Commission, it's really through the lens of how can we be advancing technologies and policies that really are in the interest of ratepayers, because these are the tools that put power into the hands of homeowners who are experiencing all-time high electricity rates. And so we've seen these technologies be a real catalyst for reducing electricity rates in other states around the country and in other countries around the world. And so that's really our focus. And, generally speaking, when we show up to these conversations, we're there representing the interests of our members. So we have about 200 members that consist of, private developers like, large utility scale solar companies, many of which are here in North Carolina, small mom and pop local installers that do your residential solar installations on your roof, technology providers, universities, local governments, and nonprofits. So we really cover anybody who helps to produce energy along with those that are actually consuming energy. So we're really representing all folks who have a touch point with energy in North Carolina.
So it goes beyond solar, but solar is still a big part of it, obviously.
Solar is still a big part of it. And I would say when you look at North Carolina right now, solar is probably the largest clean energy resource, aside from hydro. And then, I think some folks would consider nuclear a clean energy resource. And, you look at our total electricity generation mix in the state right now, it's about 40+% nuclear, 40+% natural gas. And then you've really seen a precipitous decline in coal generation here, while solar has grown up quite a bit to where solar now has overtaken coal in terms of total electricity generation here in the state. So to your point, yes, solar is a big part of it.
And you guys don't, just to put this out, you guys don't believe like everything in the state should be solar. It's an all hands on deck in a lot of ways, right? Outside of, I'm sure you don't believe coal should be your long term, but.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great question, especially in this moment right now, where we're seeing demand for electricity at an all-time high. And we've talked about this before, but a lot of that really is driven by new large load customers coming into the state of North Carolina, data centers, manufacturers. In fact, since the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022, North Carolina saw the largest amount of private investment in manufacturing in the clean energy sector of any state in the country. So we saw about $24 billion of announced manufacturing investments here in our backyard. So combine that between data centers, there's a lot of new demands for electricity, and that demand is far outpacing the actual pace of us being able to bring that generation online. So we're in a moment right now where we need every electron available to meet that demand and make sure that North Carolina remains an economically viable state. Because when you look at businesses who are looking to make investments, one of the top criteria for them making decisions is, one, how much electricity costs, and two, if they can actually have access to electricity. And so that is really important in our economic development conversation here in our backyard. And so it's going to take every electron available that we can get. And to your point, right, we're going to have to look at a well-diversified mix of resources that, include natural gas, that include nuclear, that include solar, wind, hydro. I mean, everything under the sun, because we need all of that right now to make sure we're keeping electricity rates low for ratepayers.
Nuclear's kind of made a comeback with both parties, right? I mean, I'm hearing Democrats talk about this. Was it an image problem because of Chernobyl and all that, or has it really gotten cleaner?
Well, it's a great question. Yeah. And I remember 15 years ago talking to some members of our congressional delegation about the importance of nuclear. And at that time, it was not as well received as it is right now. And I think, a lot of that really does date back to your point, some of the perception around nuclear risk from Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island, right? And our nuclear regulatory constructs here continuing to become stricter and stricter to make sure that as we develop nuclear, that they are safe, those assets are safe. And, I think at the same time, right, there have been some challenges over the past couple of decades in terms of actual development of new nuclear facilities. So you look at down in Georgia with their Vogel plant down there, right? It was originally projected to cost somewhere in the ballpark of $14 to $16 billion. It took a lot longer to develop that plant than they had imagined, and it ended up costing more than $31 billion. And so we also saw just to our south in South Carolina with the VC Summer nuclear plant. That plant ended up costing $9.5 billion. And for those that are tracking, that plant never actually came online. So you've got a $9.5 billion hole in the ground that ratepayers are having to pay for in South Carolina. And so, I think there are those challenges that, make decision makers cautious about, jumping in headfirst to that technology, because I don't think anybody wants to be left holding the bag for a really expensive asset like that never actually comes online. At the same time, we've seen a lot of venture capital flow into new startups for nuclear. And so, if you look at the startup space, there's a nuclear company for every small type of iteration of a small modular nuclear reactor that you could ever imagine. And this administration, federal administration, has made it a priority that nuclear is a part of the equation moving forward. And so there are some initiatives under DOE funding small modular nuclear development. You've seen here in North Carolina, our utilities like Duke really favor that technology and are starting. Which
doesn't stop you, but there's a proposal for 3 mini ones, right? Up in Blues Creek, or not Blues Creek. Is that right? Anyways, up in Stokes County.
Yes, and And I think Duke is excited about the prospects of the technology. I mean, I've seen. I think Duke has indicated they want to build up to 10 of those types of facilities around the state of North Carolina, and the size of those facilities vary pretty widely. I mean, you're talking about small modular nuclear reactors that could sit on the back of a truck trailer, right, all the way up to things that are the size of a warehouse. We don't have a commercially viable option yet that's on the ground and operating here in the U.S., although there are some starts of those projects in different places. Bill Gates, I believe, has a venture-backed company that's developing out in the West. We also saw just to our west in Tennessee, the Tennessee Valley Authority also file plans to build out a new small modular nuclear reactor there. However, the caveat is because we're so early in that development phase, they're still very, very expensive. So TVA, for example, their plans indicated that it would cost about $4.5 billion to develop a 330 megawatt small modular nuclear reactor. So for those that track all of this, that's not a whole lot of capacity for a whole lot of money. And so I think when you talk to the utilities here in North Carolina, they don't want to be the first mover and expose ratepayers to all of that risk. They want others to take on that risk and then for us to replicate some of that success here.
But we have time to wait for that.
We don't have time to wait for that. And that's the challenge. And that's why, we as an organization have been really adamant that in that period of time, until we get some of those new nuclear facilities on the ground, we need to be doing all that we can to invest in new solar resources, new battery resources, new wind assets, because those types of generation resources take a couple of months to develop, right, versus a couple of decades like some of these resources might take. So we've got data centers and manufacturers all knocking on our door saying, we need this. And we have utilities saying, well, we've got these things coming 10 to 15 years down the pipeline, but we're here saying we've got the solutions today via solar and battery storage to help bring those companies online, bring them into the state, and do it in a least cost way.
Okay, so solar has an interesting reputation out there.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's based on party lines, sometimes it's not. But let's talk about some of those issues that people have with it then. So when the sun's not out, what happens, and the battery storage challenges? Where are we on that? How would you characterize that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And so you mentioned, right, there's this perception there's a partisan divide around resources like solar. And I would challenge that a little bit, because when you look at some of our policies here in North Carolina, like our renewable energy portfolio standard that was passed in 2007, there are folks like Senator Tom Tillis who were, very instrumental in making sure that policy got off the ground here in North Carolina. And then going back to House Bill 589 and House Bill 951, which were some of the more recent comprehensive energy pieces of legislation at the General Assembly, you had folks like Representative John Zoka who were involved in helping to negotiate that bill with Democratic governors and with Republican leadership in the General Assembly. So we've seen proactive policies that help to move the needle in solar deployment here in the state actually come from both caucuses, and they've been done in a bipartisan fashion. But to your question around sort of the technology and the viability of it, there have been those questions, right, of like, is this a resource that we can rely on throughout the course of the year or at night, right? And over the past couple of years, we have seen the cost of battery storage decrease exponentially. And so when you're looking at new solar projects coming online, either in North Carolina or anywhere across the country, almost always now they're paired with battery storage. And so when that happens, right, you can generate all this electricity, store it all in batteries, and then be able to dispatch that in the middle of the night when you might need that somewhere else at some other time, right? So at this point, it's become reliable and dependent enough that you can lean on it as a dispatchable resource like a natural gas facility because you have the battery storage tied to it.
The other thing I hear sometimes is what happens to these panels after 20 years, and is that a bigger environmental risk than what it creates by helping with electricity? What do you say to that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. We've seen a lot of really cool, unique, innovative ways to deal with that waste. And there have been a lot of companies that have really spearheaded these efforts from the e-waste side of things, right? Consumer electronics are not new to the United States. And so we've now seen some of those companies who specialize in e-waste pivot into the solar manufacturing or solar panel recycling side of things, including a company that's actually out in Salisbury called Solar Panel Recycling. And they take all of these panels from all of these projects that have been online and in the ground for the past 15, 20 years, and they're able to recover almost every component from a solar panel and reuse that for the aluminum, for the steel, for the glass. And so you're to the point now where we've been able to manage most of the cradle to grave with all of these panels. It's not like we're just leaving them out on site to rot after they stop producing electricity. And in fact, when you look at the ordinances in a lot of counties around the state, they require those developers to put up bonds so that when it comes to the end of the project, there's assurances there that that project can be decommissioned and that farmland can be returned back to its original value so that they can start farming on that land again. But, we've seen that.
That's one of the other things you hear, too, that it ruins that land forever.
Yeah.
Not true.
Not true. Not true at all. You hear a lot of rumors like, that you're going to leach PFAS chemicals, right? And the water runoff there is going to contaminate, local water sources, right? And that's not true at all. There have been so many studies that have debunked that claim. And when you start to look at sort of redevelopment activities around the state of North Carolina, we've conducted studies to show only 0.28% of farmland actually is occupied by utility scale solar in North Carolina. You compare that to other redevelopment activities, golf courses are significantly more. Single family housing developments are about 10% of farmland in North Carolina as well. And so utility scale solar assets on farmland are a very, very small percentage of the total available farmland there. And then you start to look at the economics of it. So for, a farmer who really is struggling to make ends meet, because farming is not an easy profession. You're so subject to price volatility and price swings with, commodity pricing all around the world, right? And so for some folks, they're having to make the tough decision of, do I keep doing this anymore? And should I sell my land to be able to make ends meet? And in some cases, they're selling it off to a housing developer in which that land is never going to return back to a farming use. And instead, they can lease that out to a utility scale solar project in which, if after 20 years they say, you know what, I'm done with this, pull all the steel out of the ground, they can start farming on it again. But they're able to, over the course of that lease, make 10 to 15 times the amount per acre that they would have done farming otherwise. So this enables them to keep that property in their family and be able to make steady income over the course of that lease.
How long do these panels typically last? Is there a lifetime to them, or does it vary in size and materials? Or
Yeah, most panels that come out of the factory now have a 25-year warranty, and that's sort of the minimum threshold. There are panels out there now that have been operating for the past 50 plus years, right? And so, what you're seeing now with large utility scale solar projects, it's really a financial calculation, because the industry continues to innovate and continues to move forward to the point now where you're seeing modules that have twice the amount of capacity today than what they would have had 10 years ago. And so if you're an asset owner of these large projects, you might be looking at all the paperwork and saying, well, 10 years from now, the efficiencies might be twice what they are today, and it might make more sense at that point in time to what we call repower that project and pull those old panels out, put new, more efficient panels in so you can produce more power, make more money. And then in that case, right, you're talking about either repurposing or recycling those modules. And another cool example, I was talking to somebody in Eastern North Carolina where they were going through that repowering process. All of those old modules were being boxed up, put in shipping containers, and being taken over to Africa to help power remote villages that actually didn't have power up until that point. So lots of different ways that you can ensure that those panels are not ending up in landfills.
The technology is wild. I was just at one recently, and I heard this like, and it was moving with the sun, so it could like get the most amount of sunlight. So the panels were, I guess, a software program was moving them as the sun moved. It was remarkable.
Yeah, and those are so that example, right? Those are trackers, and so you have the ability to track the sun either on a 1-axis or a 2-axis tracker to where it's essentially following the sun all throughout the day. And we've seen really cool projects where not only is the technology advancing quite a bit, but the way that we think about the land is also advancing quite a bit. We have a member that we've worked with forever who is a pioneer in this space, Joel Olson from O2 Energy Solutions, and he has a project down in Montgomery County, Bisco, where they have some trackers there for those solar panels, but they also are really pioneering this concept called agrivoltaics. And so it's a dual use type of scenario where you're not only harvesting the sun on the land, but you're also either harvesting crops or livestock. And so in his instance, he is raising sheep and lamb down there, and they have this whole process, right, where the sheep are helping to take care of all the grass and vegetation management, and then that's turned into a whole separate business where they're then processing that lamb and serving it all around the state.
Well, that's using a little bit of everything.
Yeah.
So if I'm listening to this, I'm saying this all sounds great, and you got counterpoints to all these criticisms. So why is there still resistance, do you think, about this? And by the way, in the latest Duke Carbon Plan, they reduced solar and got rid of wind. Why?
That's a great question. I think,
and I don't mean this about Duke. I mean, some politicians still, and some of it I think is this lingering resistance that was out there based on rumors and things in the past. But
100%. And I do think there's a lot of misinformation out there, and a lot of misinformation, that has made its way into politics and policy. This is not to say in one party or another we encounter any more resistance, right? And I think where some of that comes from, going back to, you mentioned not calling out Duke, but I think it's really sort of taking a step back and looking at where the incentives are in this space right now. And you talked about seeing Duke take a step back from solar procurements as part of their carbon plan proceedings. And that's essentially our long-term generation planning process that we have at our regulator, which is the North Carolina Utilities Commission. Well, part of the challenge that we've been running into in North Carolina, and we're running into in states across the country, is who owns all of these assets. And so in North Carolina, the solar industry really grew up on the backs of entrepreneurs who saw this opportunity in the market to build out these projects through this federal program called PURPA that guaranteed automatic connection to the utility grid. So they could build this 5 megawatt project in a rural piece of farmland, and after they build out that project, so long as there's enough capacity on the transmission line nearby, they would be able to automatically interconnect and sign a 15-year agreement with the utility. Well, as you might imagine, the utilities don't love that, because that then eats into their ability to build their own power plants themselves. And when they're building power plants in North Carolina, utilities don't make money by selling you or I electricity. They make money by building. And so the incentive is essentially for every dollar that they invest into a new power plant or upgrading a transmission line or building a new transmission line, they're guaranteed right now, I think it's 10.1% rate of return. And that all goes back in the form of profits to their shareholders.
Where does that return come from in rates?
It comes from rates. So it's essentially built into the rate that you're paying on your electricity bill, and that's approved by the Utilities Commission. So they say, in order for you, utility, to have a viable business and continue to thrive here in the state and be a investor-owned utility, we need to enable you to have some sort of guaranteed return. And so they get a guaranteed return on all of their capital investment, not on their operating or not on selling you or I electricity. And so naturally that incentive somewhat runs at odds with the interest of ratepayers themselves, because if the utility is over here incentivized to build, well, that gets really expensive. And then guess who's paying for that? The ratepayers, and they're paying an extra 10% on top of all of those costs in terms of profits back to shareholders.
So they would make more money off building nuclear plants than if they built fields of solar. That's why they don't get into solar as much.
You got it. And because those solar facilities were all owned by third parties. So it might be...
But they could do their own if they wanted to, but they still wouldn't make the amount of money that they'd want to.
They could. And actually, you saw the utilities here in North Carolina do a lot of that. They had their own unregulated or deregulated division that was focused on building out new renewable projects. Well, that's not as lucrative as a guaranteed 10% rate of return. And you also saw all of these other companies that have grown up and specialized in building out solar facilities. And so they weren't able to do it as well as all these companies who really specialized in that space. And so, when I talk about just electricity regulation here in North Carolina and in a lot of other states, I think about any other industry out there. What other industry do you have a guaranteed, between 10 and 11% return on your investment every single year? I mean, it's pretty rare. And
why can't they just guarantee them that kind of money on rates, period, and not related to the growth of building?
And that's, I think, a question a lot of folks are asking right now, especially in an era where over the past 5 years, we've seen electricity rates go up 23%, and Duke has been consistently recording record profits quarter over quarter. And so something's not jiving, right? If somebody's getting a utility bill every month in which it's the highest utility bill they've ever paid, and Duke's turning around and reporting record profits for their shareholders.
This feels like just like healthcare, where the systems make it so complicated that only systems can understand it.
That's exactly right. It's an incredibly technically complicated process. And when you look at how all this is playing out at the Utilities Commission, we have a team of attorneys. Everybody else has a team of attorneys that's showing up. And I'm in this space, and I find it difficult to comprehend many times.
Well, the attorneys are the ones that win in everything these days because everybody's suing everybody or anything. I cover politics. Believe me, there's more attorneys in that than there's ever been probably in life. All right, so let's bring this all back. So, well, first of all, a lot of people are just oddly learning about data centers.
Yeah,
we've had them forever. What I find funny about it is how people are so like the Theo Von Aaron Brockovich podcast recently. Did you listen to that or hear about it? He had Aaron Brockovich on. She's kind of on a crusade now with data centers too.
Okay.
And Theo Von basically said that nobody wants these things and that they're not good. Which, that's fine.
Yeah.
But like his wealth is based on people watching and listening to his podcast, which requires data centers. And now AI is a huge growth but I find it struck me as like there's a fundamental lack of understanding about data centers, why we need them. And that's not to say they're good or bad, but also then the energy problem. Is there I don't even know how to phrase a question out of this, except for I just don't think people really. We got to educate the public about this.
I'm amazed that we've made it almost 20 minutes into the conversation, and this is the first time we've had a question about data centers.
I know.
Because I feel like in every forum that we're in these days, data centers is the most pressing issue. And I think
I'll put it this way. I think that and AI, the economy is going to be the biggest thing. Of course, we don't know what's going to happen. But I think AI and data centers is going to be the topic in 2028.
I 100% agree. And it is showing up on the campaign trail. And public polling right now around data centers is not great. Some of the most recent polling that I have seen is across party lines, about 77% of voters are opposed to data centers.
And I'm surprised it's that low.
Yeah. And I think and it's forcing candidates, right, to develop positions on this. It's forcing, folks at the legislature to really think strategically about how we deal with data centers here in North Carolina. I mean, we saw a number of bills introduced in this past short session that were focused on data centers. I don't believe any of those ended up making it across the finish line. But to your point, I think there's a lot of misinformation right now, and part of it is fueled by massive investments coming in from these large tech companies and new developments and moving relatively quickly and fear, right? And this is not unlike some of the conversations that played out in the solar industry about 10 years ago, and I think once we cut through the misinformation and help work hand in hand with communities to make sure that these projects are truly advantageous for that community, that the company who's making investments there is reinvesting and is an active partner in these developments is really, really important. And I think, so, bringing that back to the energy space here, part of the reason why it's such a pressing conversation right now, when you look at Duke's load forecast over the next 15 years or so, Duke is projecting that we are going to need about 8 times the amount of electricity over the next 15 years as to what we had been bringing online over the past 15 years. And the amount of new generation required is the equivalent of powering 5 states across the country.
Yeah, some of these big, large-scale data centers require the amount that if you see that nuclear plant, it requires all of the energy from that nuclear plant.
All of the energy, exactly. That's just one. You're exactly right. And going back to that point we were talking about earlier, when it comes to nuclear, a VC Sumner nuclear plant, costs $9.5 billion, right? And you're talking about a nuclear facility powering one data center, and those are the types of costs here. So all of that being said is when you need all of those new sources of generation, it doesn't matter what the resource is. It can be solar, it can be natural gas, it can be nuclear. No matter what, it's going to cost money. And so I think
who's going to pay for it?
Somebody's got to pay for it, right? And so, we talked about earlier, right? I think folks folks love using all these new AI tools and resources, ChatGPT, Claude. But I think, it's been a little bit of a free ride for us for quite some time, right? Because these tools need to be powered somehow. And data centers are the answer to make sure that we have those tools and resources available, and they've got to be sited somewhere. And from a national security perspective, I think we probably would rather have those data centers sited here domestically than we would in other countries like China.
And AI advancing, because if they over-advance it over us, I don't think people understand the national security threat and do our own banking and all that kind of stuff, that if China gets so far ahead of us in AI that they overpower our own AI systems.
Exactly. And so I think all of those things are really coming to a head right now. And the most important part of all of it from our perspective, right, is that as data centers are coming here to North Carolina, that we're ensuring they're paying their own way for those costs associated with new generation resources and the costs associated with upgrading transmission and distribution assets to bring that generation to the data centers. And additionally, you've seen companies like Google voluntarily spearhead efforts to reinvest in the communities around data centers. Yeah. And so that includes things like investing in energy efficiency and weatherization programs to help low and moderate income customers who have high energy bills reduce those energy bills, or helping neighboring communities invest in what we call virtual power plant programs so that homes can put solar and battery storage on, and you can aggregate all of those assets to essentially act like its own new power plant itself. And so
in some communities, it's doubling the tax base, by the way, too, for especially rural counties that are shrinking and aren't making money. And again, I'm not defending any of this at all. But to me, it comes down to I think there's a way to make sure there's a fair share of let's just put it, overly simple, that they're paying their fair share each month for how much energy that they're using. That's easy to track, I would think. The question is how we build all the infrastructure that's needed and who should pay more for that.
Yes.
Because they're clearly going to take up a lot more electricity than I am at my house over my entire lifetime and then some, right? To me, that is the more important argument than the month-to-month, because that seems easy to track.
100%.
Am I oversimplifying that? Or?
You're not oversimplifying that. It is easy to track. The utilities have that data. The problem is there isn't a clear mechanism right now that actually allows for those data centers to pay those costs. And what we've seen play out thus far at the Utilities Commission via that long-term generation plan, the utilities really want to have that ability to own all of that generation and to interconnect all of those data centers and be able to build everything at a really expensive cost and charge ratepayers for it because it's really good for their bottom line. And when you look at
But there is ways for them. I'm so sorry to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
But there are ways for them to build things to build this infrastructure on site.
Yeah.
And they could even hand it over to Duke eventually, right?
They could, yeah.
That's one other option.
And I think that's exactly the conversation that's at play right now at the Utilities Commission and at the legislature, is providing the mechanisms, what we call a bring your own capacity program or a large transition tariff. And not to get too far into the weeds, but essentially giving those customers the ability to build things like solar and battery storage or small modular nuclear reactors there on site that they pay for entirely themselves and are using that to offset some of their demand for the electricity grid. And also with something like a large load tariff, ensuring that we're properly fencing or rate fencing around those data centers so that any costs incurred associated with new generation or T&D or transmission and distribution upgrades that they are paying for themselves. We don't have either of those in place right now. So essentially, any new large customer that wants to come in like a data center, they have to go through the typical process of interconnecting to the utility. Utility adds new generation, and then we, the ratepayers, are paying for all of that.
And Duke has said they want to do some of those things, but they haven't formalized it, right? Or then they don't want to be forced to do it in a certain way. Is that a fair assessment of where we are with that?
That's a fair assessment. And some of the conversations are taking place now. And it's probably about a year or two too late because we're already feeling those pressures. I'm optimistic that we will get some positive results out of those conversations because, realistically right now, ratepayers just cannot bear more of the burden that they have been over the past 5 years. And going back to that same long-term generation plan that we were just talking about that Duke filed last fall, they're projecting that rates are going to continue to go up on average 2% every year for the next 15 years. So we're talking about another 30% rate increase on top of, depending on where the commission falls in the rate cases right now, anywhere between a 9.5% and 11.5% rate increase for customers. And so that's not tenable for many homeowners who are just trying to make ends meet month over month.
Is there a chance that these companies end up making so much money that someone gets smart and say, okay, we'll pay a little bit more?
100%. And
I'm sure people would want them to pay more.
Yeah.
And Duke's incentivized to work with them because they're such large customers, right? I mean, they make a lot of money off these guys.
They do. And I think most of these data center companies have said we are willing to pay more if it means that we have the ability to connect to the grid faster. Because right now they're running into the issue of entering into the queue and then hearing back from the utility. It might be 4 or 5 or 6 years before you're able to actually get power to your facility. And so if they can say, well, we're willing to pay a premium for our electricity costs, or we're willing to pay a premium to site generation next to our data center, or we're even willing to scale back our demand for electricity during certain times of the year in order to connect to the grid faster, they're all willing to do it. Because right now the term for data center companies is speed to market. So how fast can you get these things up so that you can start using those servers for your data center or for your AI usage? And you've already seen in other places where data centers say, you know what, we're not going to wait any longer. We're just going to do all this stuff completely off grid ourselves, and we're just going to power it without the utilities. We're going to invest in natural gas on site and solar and battery storage.
Can they do that though? With the Utilities Commission has to prove that, don't they?
You could theoretically do that here if you're fully off grid and agree never to be connected to the utility. I don't think you're going to see much of that. The amount of, again, going back to the amount of electricity that is required to power these facilities, right? It's not easy to meet all of your demand off grid yourself. You have to be somewhat reliant,
especially without
on
nuclear.
Utilities. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I find it interesting how there seems to be some parallels. Stick with me here with what the solar industry has gone through on the environmental side, right? Like there's all this talk about noise, water contamination. Energy use but the technology, one would hope, will get better with that over time and help allude to that too. And so maybe we need to fast track research into that. Do you see some of those similarities?
100%. And it's coming up in the conversations around siting solar facilities right now around North Carolina. A lot of these projects, when they're getting developed, have to ultimately get approved by the local county commission. They'll have to, vote yay on a special use permit or rezoning.
And it's heated.
Right? And in those conversations around solar facilities that are being developed, you're seeing a lot of parallels or, a lot of analogies being drawn to the data center development side of things. And so I think what we're starting to see now a little bit is this new term called banana, which is build absolutely nothing. Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone. And so it's really this sentiment around
the new NIMBY or whatever.
It's the new NIMBY, right? So not even not in my backyard. It's just not anywhere near me and absolutely nothing. And so I get that sentiment, right? If you've grown up somewhere where you live there for a reason and you've come to really appreciate the rural nature of where we are, and then you have a developer knocking on your back door saying, we're going to build this 50-acre new facility that's either going to be a big gray steel box or you're going to have modules that spread across multiple fields. That is a little jarring for somebody that's not used to it. And then I think once, to your point, you cut through that noise and you start to see what the benefits could be of some of those facilities. I'll talk on the solar side. I'm not as well versed on sort of the data center siting side of things, but on the solar side, we have seen on average in counties across eastern North Carolina that the tax base increases by more than 1,000% when you're bringing in some of these solar facilities, and so that's money that's getting reinvested into first responders, schools, at a time where some of these counties are actually seeing a decline in tax base because you have population either migrating out or slowly dying off. And so these are really, really important investments to some of these counties and really important investments to the landowners themselves, as we talked about earlier, who are having to make the tough choice. Do I keep the farmland here in my family or do I sell it to a developer, right? And so there is some inherent benefits financially to the landowner, to the county, And then beyond that, we've also seen community benefits agreements where the solar developer will say, well, I'm going to invest in this park too that you didn't have here before, or these greenway trails, so that there truly is community benefits all around. And so I think when you sit down, bring the temperature down, talk about the benefits, it can really bring a community together to say, yeah, there are some aspects that maybe I don't like about this project, but the net gain here is pretty good for us moving forward.
Well, another odd comparison to me is, if you drive around the state, if you were to visit all the prisons, they're in rural North Carolina in the middle of nowhere, a lot of them, outside of Central Prison, which is oddly right outside of downtown where the worst of the worst are. That's another story. But
yeah.
but I'm assuming, and I don't know prison history, they put them out there on purpose to be away from society, but also to have some employment in these small counties that was good, consistent, occupations and jobs for people. It seems for data centers, there's a lot of possibilities for almost the exact same type of thing. Now, I know the rural people will come yell at me with pitchforks right now, but there is an opportunity for that if we find the right places to put these things.
Yes. And I mean,
why would you want to build a massive thing next to Uptown Charlotte anyways?
That's right.
And if you're one of these companies.
I think also to call out maybe a little bit of the obvious too, right, is that the actual land is a little cheaper, right, when you start to go out into the rural areas. And these are not small projects. And that's,
football fields long.
Yes. I mean, they're massive. And solar projects are not small projects either. Even, on the smaller end, you're looking at facilities that, could be anywhere in the ballpark of 20 to 25 acres up to, a couple hundred acres. Again, like relatively small compared to the amount of available land that we have here in the state, but it's not as viable to site those types of projects near a downtown area.
So do you think this is all happening really fast, just like AI is happening very fast? Do you think we do get to a point where we can start finding some middle ground? Like right now, the battles are all happening in small town councils. I feel bad for some of these people that they're like a pharmacist. They've owned a drugstore for 50 years and they're also happen to want to serve their community and having to make decisions on ridiculously complicated things like this and have people come at them with pitchforks.
Yeah.
I'm sure some people, and we talked about it, the state, could make some decisions about putting some parameters on. That's really the next most important step of this, right? To agree on some things. And maybe it is at the local level and let every community choose for themselves. But it seems like there needs to be some fast fact gathering and to sort of get our arms around this.
Yeah, I've got to say, I don't envy the role that county commissioners have to play in making these types of siting decisions because one way or another, it's going to be a really difficult decision. We've seen in states across the Midwest, as county commissioners have made the decision to approve a project, there are death threats, there are people shooting at their homes, and vice versa, right? Like if you're making the decision to deny that project, look at all the revenue that you're saying goodbye to that might then go to your neighboring county. And that also is going to be on sort of your record as an elected official in that county itself. So not an easy decision one way or another. I think to your point around what are the other options here, we have started to see other states essentially find some pressure relief valves. And that might mean looking at, is there a statewide approach here where we say, you know what, if it's too hot temperature-wise around this conversation in this county, let's give them the ability to punt some of those decisions up either to a regulatory body or to the legislature to help figure out whether this is best for the state or that region within the state. At the same time, preserving the ability of that county, if they want to make that decision, to be able to make that decision. Because I think the last thing that local county commissioners want in this conversation too is to see their authority preempted around citing large developments in their backyard, right? You don't want to lose that decision-making ability and then having some obscure regulatory body, somewhere down the road in Raleigh or wherever making the decision that we're going to now cite 10 new data centers over here in, Harnett County or Stokes County or whatnot, right? So that's not the direction to go. But I do think there is some middle ground where you can still retain some of that authority, but also lean on partners at the state level in case there's just not a clear path at the local level. And so you've seen states on the solar side, for example, like Michigan spearhead that. You've seen states like Ohio, I believe it was last year or the year before, it was House Bill 15, which is a siting bill that also sort of helps to ensure there is a viable path forward while also making sure that you're not preempting local authority. So I think there are some blueprints that we could look to and potentially follow, but I don't want to speak for our legislators in terms of how they're thinking about this issue, but I know for sure that they are.
Well, it's so funny, the legislature, and I don't mean Republicans because Democrats have done it too, they started the counties through the charters, and they like to keep control. For people that don't know, this state, the legislature, has significant power over local governments, and I don't see them ceding that. But in this instance, it's such a hot issue, they may say, let the locals deal with it and deal with the heat so we don't have to. And I also think, the data centers companies, they certainly don't want this to go to a vote because I think we're years away from people accepting them from a public. I mean, maybe never. I don't know. But I do think, look, the chips have gotten so small. This cell phone I'm holding, if you would have showed me this 40 years ago, I would have laughed at you. So it's possible that these supercomputers become ultra supercomputers and get smaller too. We just don't know. I mean, it's happening so fast.
It is happening so fast. I mean, look what happened, what was like a year and a half ago with DeepSeek, where the efficiencies of, AI large learning models are becoming much, much more efficient. And, given the amount of investment that's pouring into the AI space right now, I would suspect that we're going to continue to see those efficiency improvements continue to progress over the next couple of years. And hopefully that means we need less of these facilities around the country because we're able to utilize the facilities that are already there. But I don't see that right now. And so now we have
put them underwater where it's cooler.
And Elon Musk is talking about putting them out in space.
That's right.
Yeah.
You never know. I mean, you just don't know where technology is going to go because it is going so fast. Real quick, I've seen ads from some data center coalition of some sort, and I've seen Duke Energy ads a lot, touting what they're doing. Is that a clear sign of this public perception issue, do you think?
It is a clear sign that there is a lot of misinformation. And I think there is an interest in making sure that the facts are getting out there around the impacts that data centers are and are not having. Because to be clear, there are impacts. To be clear, there are also things that are out there in the public ether that are just not true. And so I think what Duke and this coalition are doing is trying to set the record straight on some of these and seeing just public sentiment around data centers. We talked about earlier the polling around data centers. It's not great right now. And so if you're a company that has an interest in continuing to build out those facilities here in North Carolina, you've got to figure out how to change the public sentiment around your development, your investments. And as the utility, right, we saw this play out in the rate case proceedings here more recently, where there were more than 40,000 public comments that were filed with the Utilities Commission around the rate cases and the rate case hikes. And a lot of those are really focused on data centers. We also saw in the public hearings, data centers were a hot topic in which Duke, is getting blamed for all of these data centers and for rate hikes associated directly with data centers. And so it's imperative, for them to really help figure out how to change the narrative and ensure.
But data centers are an easy boogeyman to blame for rate increases, which it's not all them.
It's not all them,
but it is a huge part.
It is a big part. And you look at moving ahead, right? Duke has said, between 70 and 85% of all their new electrical load or electricity load that they're projecting is coming from large customers like data centers. But you take a step back and you look at the real reasons why electricity costs have been going up so much over the past 5 years. This is more historic than looking forward, but it is storm recovery costs. Think about Hurricane Helene and having to rebuild the entire grid out in Western North Carolina. Fuel costs, natural gas, because of all the geopolitical issues that have been going on in Europe, have really caused prices to spike. And that gets back to the ratepayers. And then we just have an aging infrastructure, like aging grid.
Well, the concrete that's required, like for another nuclear plant or something, I'm sure
is insane.
Wild.
Yes. And so all of those factors combined, it's really technically complicated. And to your point, data centers are an easy scapegoat.
Yeah, exactly. Listen, I could talk all day about this. Thank you for coming. By the way, for those that might be ticked off about what we're talking about or disagree or, from the data center world or Duke Energy, you're more than welcome to come on anytime because I think, again, outside of the economy, which is always the biggest issue that's in this, I think this is going to be the biggest political issue over the next decades.
100%.
Matt, thank you.
Thanks, Tim.